Was he a sexually depraved lawyer? A sadistic surgeon, perhaps even royalty? Who was the monster prowling the gaslit alleys of London?
He walks and he lives within walking distance of where these crimes are happening. Somebody on the verge of breakdown, I think.
Despite all the best efforts of professional and amateur crime sleuths, the Ripper remains as elusive as he was in the late 1800s.
We're talking about someone who can commit a murder and then lose himself in streets. Jack the Ripper is the classic whodunit.
Today, London bears little resemblance to the city once haunted by Jack the Ripper. The gaslights and handsome carriages that dotted the metropolis have long since vanished, replaced by structures of concrete and glass. A small, unassuming convent is one of the few buildings left from the time of Jack's violent reign, a lone witness to the evil that descended upon London's East End all those years ago. In 1888, London's East End is little more than a 1 square mile ghetto. For the ragged masses that call it home, survival is a daily struggle.
This was a skid row of the metropolis. A terrible area of considerable slums and poverty.
You had the Ashkenazi Jews from Russia and Poland. You had a lot of Irish immigrants who'd come over with the potato famine. And it was a noisy, bustling area. It was a dirty and very, very violent area.
Violent crime is a common occurrence in the East End's Whitechapel and Spitalfields districts, but a brutal series of assaults and slayings committed between April and August of 1888 seized the public's attention. Among the victims is 45-year-old Emma Smith, who on April 3rd is assaulted with a blunt instrument. She dies the following day. 3 months later, prostitute and street vendor Martha Tabram meets a horrible end. On August 6th, Tabram's last hours are spent soliciting customers with another streetwalker named Pearlie Paul.
They picked up a pair of soldiers, went into different alleys with them, and Pearlie Paul never saw Martha again. Her body was found on the staircase of a lodging house the following dawn. She had over 40 stab wounds to the body. Many of them were in the abdominal area, and it is possible that this was the Ripper's first frenzied assault.
The man in charge of the investigation is Inspector Edmund Reed, a 16-year veteran of the Metropolitan Police. The 5'6" Reed once held the dubious distinction of being the shortest man on the force. Despite his stature, the clever East End Detective Inspector Reed, as one newspaper called him, had moved rapidly up the ranks to his current position as head of Whitechapel's Criminal Investigation Department. Reed has 2 witnesses in the Tabram case, a police constable and Pearlie Paul.
The last person she was seen with was a soldier. Identification parades were held in an effort to identify these soldiers. But the identification parades failed and nobody was identified.
At Tabram's inquest on August 9th, the coroner declares that her murder is one of the most horrible crimes that has been committed in some time past. Despite an atmosphere of fear, prostitutes are desperate for money. They continue to peddle their wares in the darkened streets and back alleys of Whitechapel. Mary Ann Polly Nichols is among those unfortunate souls. On the evening of August 31st, Nichols shows off her new hat to the owner of her boarding house. Though short on her rent, she drunkenly brags that with her jolly bonnet, she'll soon have her money. Polly heads out into the night, unaware of the grisly fate that awaits her.
At around 3:30 a.m. on August 31st, 1888, a carter named George Cross was walking along this East London thoroughfare, then called Bucks Row, when he spied a bundle lying in a gateway that stood here. Crossing to investigate, he saw it was the body of a woman. Within moments, another carter, Robert Paul, had joined him, and they decided to go and find a police officer. They came back with 3, one of whom, P.C. Neal, shone his bullseye lantern onto the woman, and the 5 men saw to their horror that her throat had been cut.
And when her body was removed to the mortuary, it was found that not only had her throat been cut almost to the bone, but there was a great mutilating gash down her abdomen. Now, if you like, that gash in itself was a clue to the personality of the killer. This wasn't just somebody robbing her and cutting her throat. There was something sick about the killer himself.
Wild rumors run rampant throughout London. Some citizens write to the police speculating that the murders are being committed by acclaimed American actor Richard Mansfield, who is currently playing the title role in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde at a West End theater. On the morning of Nichols' death, the Star newspaper's headlines blare, "A revolting murder, another woman found horribly mutilated in Whitechapel. Ghastly crimes by a maniac." The next day, the Star follows up with even more sensationalized coverage of the murders of Emma Smith, Martha Tabram, and Polly Nichols.
In each case, the victim has been a woman of abandoned character. Each of the ill-lighted thoroughfares to which the women were decoyed to be foully butchered are off-turnings from Whitechapel Road. The fact that these 3 tragedies are so strangely alike in their details is forcing on all minds the conviction that they are the work of some cool, cunning man with a mania for murder.
The alarming similarities of the murders are not lost on the Metropolitan Police, and Scotland Yard is called in to investigate. They assign one of their most decorated detectives to the case, Inspector Frederick George Aberline. The portly veteran of 25 years will soon find himself matching wits with history's most nefarious serial killer.
Come listen to a dreadful tale I'm telling. In Whitechapel 3 murders have been done. With horror many hearts they now are swelling. Those fearful deeds that now to light have come.
So begins a song that echoes throughout London's East End following the vicious murder of Mary Ann Polly Nichols in late August of 1888. The 600,000 men, women, and children who call the city's poorest enclave home now live in constant fear. A faceless, nameless killer stalks their nighttime streets.
I think the main thing to remember about the Nichols murder is that the newspapers and the police suddenly thought, have we got a repeat killer on our hands here? And it was immediately associated with the previous murders of Emma Smith and Martha Tabram, which probably weren't related at all, but it was certainly in the press that there may be a maniac at large.
L&P Walter and Son of Spitalfields, a clothing manufacturer, writes to England's Home Office asking them to offer a reward in exchange for information leading to the arrest of the murderer. Much to the public's dismay, the government summarily rejects the request.
Rewards had in fact been offered by the Metropolitan Police and others at various times in the past, and the policy had been discontinued because it was felt the offering of rewards encouraged people to give false information in the hope of getting the reward.
Down on the streets of East End, Inspector Frederick Aberline of Scotland Yard and Inspector Edmund Reed of Whitechapel Division, along with their men, methodically search for the killer. The press scrutinizes their every move.
The police were under absolutely outrageous pressure. This was partly nothing to do with them. The first elections to the London County Council were about to happen, and the Radical Party had every hope of winning the East End. They realized that a set of sordid murders in this area gave them the opportunity in the newspapers to say, look at the social conditions here. Look why the government is doing nothing, vote Radical.
Detectives on the case have little time to worry about political maneuverings. They are in a race to catch their man before he kills again. On September 5th, the Star identifies their prime suspect, a ne'er-do-well known as Leather Apron.
A great scare began about somebody called Leather Apron. Leather Apron was supposed to threaten the local prostitutes and extort money from them at knife point, and a number of the prostitutes thought that this man may well have been the Ripper.
The real point, of course, is that it was known that Leather Apron was Jewish, and it had nearly started anti-Semitic rioting with the suggestion that a Jew was committing these murders.
Even as tensions grow hotter and the search for Leather Apron intensifies, the killer strikes again on September 8th, just before dawn. The victim is 47-year-old prostitute Annie Chapman.
This was in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, and of course there was severe mutilation. He totally opened the abdominal cavity. Her genitals were on her shoulder. He'd removed the womb and taken it away with him, cut her throat, and it was a very unpleasant sight.
This time, the police have an eyewitness, Mrs. Long, a passerby on the night of the crime.
Mrs. Long, who identified Chapman as a woman she'd seen standing talking to a man at 29 Hanbury Street, described the man as a little taller than the woman, and Chapman was 5 feet tall. He looked foreign. We don't know why she thought he looked foreign. And she also heard him say to the woman, "Will you?" And she replied, "Yes." And there's a further descriptive passage in the local press of the time, which didn't appear in the police reports, that he was wearing a long overcoat and a deerstalker hat.
In addition to Mrs. Long's testimony, a leather apron is found lying in the rear yard of 29 Hanbury Street. 2 days later, Sergeant William Thick of the Metropolitan Police arrests boot finisher John Pizer, the man reputed to be Leather Apron. The police fight through angry mobs as they lead Pizer into the station for questioning. Cries of murderer and Leather Apron fill the air.
Now, Pizer had a dodgy record. He had attacked a man with a knife the previous year, and he was charged with indecent assault on a prostitute shortly before the murders began.
Under questioning, Pizer denies that he has ever been referred to as Leather Apron. Sergeant Thick contradicts his testimony, saying he has known him for 18 years and that he's definitely the man known by that name. Eventually, Pizer provides a credible alibi and is released. The leather apron found in the yard proves to be a red herring as well. It belongs to a nearby resident. Adding to Scotland Yard's frustration, several other suspects brought in and interrogated are cleared of suspicion. England's preeminent police force comes under fire, even enduring barbs slung from across the Atlantic. The day after Chapman's murder, the New York Times reports.
Whitechapel fiend murdered his fourth victim this morning and still continues. Undetected, unseen, unknown. There's panic in Whitechapel. The London police and detective force is probably the stupidest in the world.
Serious historians recognize that, given the limitations of forensic science, which was effectively non-existent at the time, the police really did as good a job as one could reasonably expect.
The police put detectives in disguise on the streets, just trying to look the part, wearing patches, walking sticks, anything to make them not look like a detective. But the joke of the time was that whatever they dressed up in, they always kept their big policeman's boots on and gave themselves away.
The Star advocates photographing Annie Chapman's eyes in hopes that the killer's image is seared on her retina. Only slightly less ludicrous is a prominent politician's suggestion that the murderer is actually a jealous woman. By September of 1888, dozens of additional detectives and policemen have been moved into the East End. They are joined by members of the newly formed Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. Headed by businessman George Lusk, the group makes yet another suggestion that a reward be offered. They are rejected again, a response that sets off a new firestorm of criticism.
There was a lot of press antagonism towards the police, who were accused at one point of not really making much effort to find out who the Ripper was, and that they would have made a greater effort if it had taken place in the richer areas of the West End.
The police continue to haul in dozens of suspects from the East End, Inspector Aberline points to Joseph Eisenschmidt, a mad Swedish butcher, as the principal suspect. At the inquest for Annie Chapman, Coroner Wynne Baxter concludes the killer has surgical expertise based upon the degree of the mutilations and the fact that Chapman's uterus is missing.
The main theories thrown out at the time were that the Ripper might be a butcher or a doctor. This was because some of the medical men examining the bodies thought that he showed some anatomical knowledge. One of them thought he showed actual real skill. One should add immediately that others thought he showed no skill whatever.
Medical knowledge or not, the killer tries his hand as a writer in the first of 2 letters sent to the Central News Agency on September 27th.
Dear boss, I keep hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. The next job I do, I shall clip the lady's ears off and send to the police officers just for jolly. Wouldn't you? Yours truly, Jack the Ripper.
The murderous fiend now has a name.
The senior police at the time thought that the letters were the work of a journalist who wanted to keep the story going. Most serious scholars today are quite sure that these letters did not come from the murderer. But what a name he'd created, Jack the Ripper.
September 24th, 1888. Playwright George Bernard Shaw pens an acerbic letter to the Star protesting living conditions in the East End.
Will you allow me to make a comment on the success of the Whitechapel murderer in calling attention for a moment to the social question? Whilst we conventional social democrats were wasting our time on education, agitation, and organization, some independent genius has taken the matter in hand.
The independent genius Shaw speaks of is none other than Jack the Ripper. In a letter to the Central News Agency dated September 25th, he enthusiastically brags, "My knife's so nice and sharp, I want to get to work right away." The letter is passed along to Scotland Yard, where there is a belief its author may not be an Englishman.
There was the thought that he might be an American. Now this arose because of the famous Jack the Ripper letters, which used phrases which at the time were thought of as Americanisms, notably the opening, "Dear Boss."
Regardless of his nationality, the Ripper makes good on his threat to get to work right away.
At 1 a.m. on the 30th of September, a carter named Louis Dimschitz pulled his cart into the backyard of the Polish and Jewish Working Men's Club at number 30 Berners Street, on the site now occupied by this school. As he did so, his pony sheared up with alarm and pulled away to the right. Dimschitz climbed down to see what had disturbed the beast and discovered the body of Jack the Ripper's 3rd victim, Elizabeth Stride.
She'd only had her throat cut, and the argument for her being a Ripper victim is the killer was disturbed by the arrival of the witness Dimschitz in his horse and cart, and the killer then made his way off without carrying out any further mutilation. I don't think Stride was a Ripper victim, but I can't prove that.
Police quickly arrive at the murder site and launch an intensive search of the area. They believe the killer may still be lurking nearby in the shadows. Even as police frantically canvass the neighborhood, new horrific events are about to unfold less than a mile away, in the heart of London.
1:45 a.m. on the morning of the 30th of September 1888, P.C. Watkins of the City Police turned into Mitre Square. With his bullseye lantern, he began to move around the corners of the square. When the beam illuminated the spot just over here, he saw a bundle, approached it, and stumbled upon the body of Catherine Eddowes, Jack the Ripper's 4th victim.
And here is where we see him getting horribly into his stride. Some very detailed post-mortem obsessive activity attacking the face.
He nicked both eyes, he put V-shaped cuts on her cheek. The tip of her nose was cut off, she had a diagonal slash across her right cheek, and part of one of her earlobes had been detached and fell off. The abdomen was totally opened up, intestines removed. He took away with him the left kidney and the uterus.
For the first time since the murders began, police find significant clues on Goulston Street, back in the East End.
One is a piece of apron, and this is important because it was a piece of Catherine Eddowes' apron. And he'd used it to wipe his hands on. It was covered with blood and mess from inside her body.
The second clue is a cryptic message scrawled in chalk on a nearby wall. The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing.
I think the explanation for the writing on the wall in Goulston Street is it was mere graffiti. I personally think it had nothing to do with the murders. Certainly the apron was Eddowes, but I think the writing was probably already on the wall.
In spite of objections from the London City Police, who become involved because of the Eddowes slaying in their jurisdiction, Metropolitan Police Commissioner Sir Charles Warren orders the message erased.
Because he believed that anything referring to the Jews, close to a genuine Ripper clue, which the apron was likely to start up the anti-Semitic rioting which had threatened as soon as it was known the police were looking for a Jew.
Several witnesses come forward who have seen both women just prior to their deaths. Israel Schwartz, a Hungarian immigrant, witnesses a man assault Elizabeth Stride just minutes before she's killed. Schwartz goes on to describe Stride's attacker as a man 5 foot 5 inches tall with dark hair and clothing, a small brown mustache, and a peaked cap. Meanwhile, there's also a witness in the Catherine Eddowes case. The man Joseph Lewendy sees with Eddowes is a far cry from the dapper stranger associated with Jack the Ripper today.
If you mention that name, Jack the Ripper, to anybody, it conjures up this image of a man in a top hat carrying a Gladstone bag, stalking the shadows, looking for his unsuspecting prey. That isn't what he would have looked like. If anybody like that had approached the prostitutes at the height of the panic, then they would have screamed out and attracted attention.
We know from the descriptions that he wore a peaked cap or hat, that he probably wore a pea jacket and a loosely tied scarf round his neck. If anything, he'd have had something of the appearance of a seaman.
We're talking about someone who can commit a murder and then lose himself in streets where you have anything up to 10,000 people walking through those streets. And to have done that, he must have been someone who didn't stand out from the crowd.
How is the Ripper able to commit such gory mutilations and escape without being covered in blood? Detective Edmund Reed later described the police's frustration and the killer's cunning modus operandi.
The position of the blood in the body showed that he had slashed her throat with his right hand from right to left, causing the blood to spurt away from him, so that he probably never had any bloodstains on his clothes. One of the great difficulties of the case for the police was that it was a case of a maniac's cunning outwitting reason's methods.
On the morning after the double murder, the Central News Agency receives a taunting postcard from Jack the Ripper. It is written in red ink and matches the handwriting of the previous correspondence. It is believed that the letter was written on September 30th, the date of the killings.
I was not codding, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number one squealed a bit, couldn't finish it straight off. Had not time to get ears for police. Thanks for keeping last letter back till I got to work again. Jack the Ripper.
On the same day the letter arrives at the Central News Agency, the Lord Mayor of London offers a £500 reward for information leading to the conviction of Catherine Eddowes' killer. He receives nearly 1,400 tips. Fear of the Ripper leads many prostitutes to abandon their nocturnal pursuits. Scotland Yard increases the number of men on patrol from 27 to 89. No two policemen are further than 15 minutes from each other as they walk their beats. Copies of the two Ripper letters are published and posted throughout the East End in the hopes that someone will recognize the handwriting. On October 16th, George Lusk, head of the Citizens Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, receives a mysterious parcel in the mail.
It was a small cardboard box containing half a human kidney longitudinally divided. and a letter from hell stating it was half the kidney he'd taken from one of the women, which he had preserved. It wasn't signed with any name, it just said, "Catch me when you can."
The one letter that some experts today think might be genuine is the Lusk letter. But the kidney is really another of the slightly grey areas. For a long time, we all thought it was a hoax. But more recently, Mick Warren, the editor of Ripperana, who is himself a surgeon, has looked closely at the medical report on Catherine Eddowes, and there are medical reasons for thinking that this kidney could have come from Catherine Eddowes.
Even as Lusk receives the macabre package, Scotland Yard and city police bring in more than 80 suspects for questioning and follows up on hundreds of leads. As weeks pass by, public fear abates a bit, and many of the East End's 1,200-plus prostitutes return to their nighttime rounds. This development plays right into the hands of the opportunistic killer, a fact lamented by Chief Inspector Henry Moore, a colleague of Inspector Aberline's.
What makes it so easy for him is that the women lead him of their own free will to the spot where they know interruption is least likely. It's not as if he had to wait for his chance. They make the chance for him.
Mary Jane Kelly is not one of those women, although she works as a prostitute in the East End. The attractive 25-year-old sees her clients in her boarding room at Miller's Court. Her rent is well overdue, so she continues working despite the fact a killer is on the loose. In the early morning hours of November 9th, a man carrying a parcel, and who is later described as foreign-looking with a carroty mustache, enters Mary Jane Kelly's room. A couple of hours later, neighbors report hearing a cry of murder, but no one investigates any further.
At 10 o'clock in the morning on the 9th of November 1888, a rent collector turned into Dorset Street, now obliterated by these modern developments. He turned into Miller's Court and knocked on the door of the ground floor room. He got no reply. He pulled aside a curtain that covered a broken window pane and discovered the body of Mary Kelly, Jack the Ripper's final victim.
Her organs were spread all over the bed, lumps of flesh on the bedside table, her thighs were cut down to the thigh bone, the face had virtually been totally removed. If any organ was removed and taken away in the case of Kelly, it was just the heart, and not, as with the other previous two, the uterus. It was just a terrible sight.
At least 5 women have died at the hands of the Ripper. A distraught Queen Victoria telegraphs the Prime Minister urging some very decided action. England's cabinet authorizes a pardon to anyone who comes forward as an accomplice of Kelly's killer. Meanwhile, Scotland Yard again increases its number of patrols from 89 to 143 men. But it proves to be a case of too little, too late, for the killings mysteriously cease. Or do they? Over an 8-month period in 1888, at least 5 and as many as 8 murders are attributed to Jack the Ripper. Following the grisly slaying of Mary Jane Kelly in November of that same year, the police brace themselves for the madman's next fiendish act. But mysteriously, the murders cease.
There can be no doubt that the murders stopped, either because the murderer died, or he was arrested, incarcerated, or prevented from moving by some other cause, or just possibly because he moved somewhere else and his renewed murders were never noted. There is no other reason why this type of murderer stops.
Eventually, the Metropolitan Police reduce their patrols as the havoc wreaked by the Ripper dissipates and life in the slum-ridden East End returns to normal. Or so it seems.
It's a common fallacy that the murders ceased after November 1888 because, of course, we have the murder of Alice Mackenzie on the 17th of July 1889. The final Whitechapel murders victim was Francis Coles on the 13th of February 1891.
Could it be that Jack the Ripper has returned after a 7-month respite from his bloody rampage? The theory is taken up by Inspector Edmund Reed of the Metropolitan Police.
Inspector Reed seemed to think that Mackenzie and Coles were in fact also Ripper victims.
Despite Reed's beliefs, the killings, while violent, lack the frenzied characteristics of the earlier crimes. Some close to the case suggest they are the work of a copycat killer.
It's unlikely, I would think, that any of those subsequent crimes were the work of the Ripper.
The police are divided as to just how many women the Ripper actually killed, a debate that rages on today among Ripper historians.
I don't think there's anything unusual in there being uncertainty about the number of victims we can ascribe to any one serial killer. My own belief is that Jack the Ripper killed between 4 and 6 women.
Most so-called experts plump for 5, and they are Nichols, which was the 31st of August 1888, through Annie Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, and the final victim being Mary Kelly. On the police file, which still exists, cover 11 murders. If I had to put my hand on my heart and say how many were killed by one hand, you could really only name 3 if you're looking at modus operandi, and the 3 would be Nichols, Chapman, and Eddowes.
But even more controversial than the number of victims attributed to Jack the Ripper is the identity of the man himself. In 1894, a memorandum written by Sir Melville Macnaghten, Assistant Chief Constable of Scotland Yard's Criminal Investigation Department, appears in the Sun newspaper.
He penned a document naming 3 people he thought were likely suspects: Druitt, Ostrog, and Kosminski. This 1894 mention is the first mention we find of those names in connection with the murders.
Druitt was a school teacher and barrister. He committed suicide at the end of 1888, shortly after the murder of Mary Kelly. Apparently feared that he was going insane. We have absolutely no knowledge or idea of why he ever became a candidate for being the Ripper, other than the fact that Macnaghten says the family thought that he was possibly the murderer.
The second suspect is believed to be Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-Jewish hairdresser who was declared legally insane in 1888. Sir Robert Anderson, head of Scotland Yard CID, claims that a witness identified this man as the murderer. In the end, claims that he has a hatred of women and strong homicidal tendencies prove unfounded, and Kosminski is ruled out as a suspect by most Ripperologists. Macnaghten's third and final suspect is Michael Ostrog, a Russian con man who has passed himself off as everything from a surgeon to a priest.
Ostrog, I think we can fairly safely dismiss. He was a much older man. He was a con man and a petty thief, and was probably in France at the time of the murders.
Macnaghten and Anderson are but 2 of the scores of men with a vested interest in the Whitechapel murders. What about the detectives in the field? Who did they think committed the killings? In 1903, now retired Detective Frederick Aberline suspects George Chapman, a man who was convicted of poisoning his 3 wives.
Aberline believed that if you were wicked enough to poison your wives, you were clearly wicked enough to be Jack the Ripper. Well, wicked enough may be, but psychologically, they're totally different types of crime, and Chapman clearly was not Jack the Ripper.
Aberline later concedes, however, that Scotland Yard is really no wiser on the subject than it was 15 years ago. When an American journalist visits the Yard's crime museum in the early 1900s, he asks why there are no relics of the Ripper murders. The detective conducting the tour replies, "There is no more of a clue to that chap's identity than there is to the identity of some murderer who will kill someone 100 years from now." Although more than 100 years have passed since Jack the Ripper took his last victim, the case remains attractive to crime sleuths, both amateur and professional alike.
Year after year, books come out and theories come out, and each year you'll think, we've caught him, that's definitely him, that's convinced me, and then you'll read the next book and think, oh, that could be him as well.
The hunt for Jack the Ripper is no longer carried out on the streets of London's East End. Instead, men and women seeking the Ripper's true identity spend countless hours sifting through thousands of documents in libraries and archives around the world. In 1992, a journal surfaces that is purported to be that of Jack the Ripper. The author is supposedly James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton broker who died in 1889. Numerous experts are called in to ascertain the document's authenticity.
There's no information in the Maybrick diary which is in any way significant, there's nothing there which tells us anything or provide us with any additional information, which is one of the reasons why so many people initially considered it was a forgery anyway.
Year after year, the public is deluged with some rather sensational Jack the Ripper theories, ranging from speculation that the Ripper was Queen Victoria's grandson, Prince Albert, to a suggestion that the crimes were the work of the secretive Order of Freemasons. In 1993, Ripper historian Stuart Evans makes a stunning discovery: an 80-year-old letter written by Chief Inspector John George Littlechild, head of Special Branch, Scotland Yard.
I found the Littlechild letter naming a brand new suspect that nobody had ever heard of before. And that was Dr. Tumblety, the quack American doctor.
Though court records from the time indicate that Tumblety was arrested on November 7th for gross indecency with a male, it's possible that he was released in time to still have murdered Mary Jane Kelly 2 days later on the 9th. A week and a half later, Tumblety jumps bail and flees to America.
Scotland Yard officers pursued him to New York, so they obviously felt there was something a bit more serious than the misdemeanor of gross indecency.
Tumblety eludes his pursuers and is never captured. Though much of his private life is cloaked in mystery, the not-so-good doctor remains a prime suspect today.
I think if I had to give my own opinion on what the Ripper looked like, I would paint a picture of a person similar to Tumblety, who was a great misogynist. He hated prostitutes. He got an anatomical collection, if the stories are to be believed in the States, of rooms in glass jars. He's got all the prerequisites, and I think Tumblety is the right sort of man.
As with nearly every other facet of the Ripper murders, there is controversy about Tumblety's viability as a suspect, largely because of his alleged homosexuality.
Now, homosexual serial killers kill other men. They don't kill women. In the case of the Ripper, we are definitely looking for a heterosexual, not for someone like Dr. Tumblety.
If not Tumblety, who are the prime suspects today? Was Jack the Ripper truly a madman who lived in the East End?
I believe that Jack the Ripper was probably a man who was put into the asylum under the name of David Cohen by the police. Now, he goes in at precisely the right time for the murders to stop. He is a poor foreign immigrant Jew from Whitechapel, and he is the most violent man to appear in Coney Hatch workhouse records over the next 2 years.
My own personal opinion is that it was someone who, as many of the police officers who worked on the case say, was just an ordinary Polish Jewish immigrant living in the heart of the neighborhood.
The true identity of Jack the Ripper is something that we may never really know, but it's very difficult to say that with any certainty because so much has happened over the last few years.
In 1988, John Douglas, a former agent and profiler from the FBI's renowned Behavioral Science Unit, attempts to reconstruct Jack the Ripper's personality. Douglas believes that the Ripper mutilated animals as a child, worked as a butcher or mortuary attendant, was plagued by paranoia and probably carried a knife for protection. Douglas also guesses that the Ripper lived or worked very near the location of his first murder and harbored a great hatred for women and prostitutes.
Psychologically speaking, we're talking about someone who was very much in control of his emotions to begin with, but then this bloodlust, this need to murder. Motive-wise, there's no motive. He does it for the satisfaction of the murders.
Given the advances in criminology and psychological profiling, coupled with the tireless research of historians, we may one day learn Jack the Ripper's true identity. Until then, the world must content itself with a gruesome legend that grows larger with each passing day.
You've got Victorian gaslit streets, Victorian fogs, hansom cabs. It's the whole romance of the period. The magic name Jack the Ripper.
I think everybody likes a whodunit, and Jack the Ripper is the classic whodunit.